This is a quick instructional video on what singular value decomposition is doing within RoPE. So what does singular value decomposition do? Let's take a very simple example. Let's say that we have observed a particular ligand in various conformations in a set of protein structures. I've chosen a very simple ligand with two torsion angles, chi1 and chi2, for example. Now, let's say that we draw a scatter plot of all of the values of chi1 and chi2 as they have been observed in these structures. And let's choose a distribution like this. Now, if I were to ask you, what is the variation in this data set, then it's reasonably straightforward. You can project all of the values down onto the chi1 axis and therefore determine that this is a big variance of the torsion angles. Similarly, for the chi2 torsion angle, we can project those down and determine that this is a small variance. Job done, everyone's happy. But let's say that instead we collected a different distribution. In this case, we have a very similar distribution, but this time the values of chi1 and chi2 are correlated. Now, if we attempt to perform the same analysis on the variation, then we're going to determine that both of the variances are medium. But in fact, you can see that the distribution of this plot is similar to the one above and should produce a similar result. This is where singular value decomposition can come in. What it does is it provides a set of new axes which best describes the variance in the data set. So in this case, it's going to rotate this plot by a few degrees to produce two new basis vectors. Here I've called them A0 and A1, and the nice thing is that we can now determine that the variances are the same as the one above. But this time the basis vectors are able to be re-expressed in terms of the chi1 and chi2 values, so you never lose that information. So in this case, A0 is a positive correlation between chi1 and chi2, whereas A1, with the smaller variance, has a negative correlation. It takes one part of chi1 in the negative term plus a positive term of chi2. So the nice thing about singular value decomposition is that it will give you the list of the axes, which maximizes the variation in the dataset as shown in this example. We have the variance of each axis, we have the direction in terms of the original values, and we have the fact that each of the axes is perpendicular to each other. So this means that we have one axis for each of the original chi1 and chi2 values, and these are related by 90 degrees. If we were to view the points in the new basis vectors, then we can call this principal component analysis. In this case, I've given you an example with just 2 dimensions. So all of the things that you see here may not seem particularly important, but when you go to n dimensions, it's really important to be able to view these data in the new coordinate system provided by SVD. Some things you still need to watch out for when you're looking at these plots. So, principal components are not necessarily reflecting the functional directions in the data. They can, but they don't necessarily need to. So, for example, you may have a set of points which are delineated by some kind of boundary condition. So you have a high condition and a low condition. But in this case, the SVD will report the biggest variance, which is not the same as the axis showing the condition change. So that's something to bear in mind. Another thing is that axes with similar variances are going to be ill-determined. So if we have a random distribution of points and it's not entirely clear where the axes of variation should point, they will point in a direction which is largely determined by the noise, and so you can not necessarily trust the individual directions of these axes. And then finally, SVD is a linear decomposition, which means that the nonlinear features can be hazardous when it comes to interpretation. So this is something to be quite careful about. If we have a path here, which could theoretically be expressed as a linear pathway, then it's going to come up with two basis vectors. And this suggests that there are two ways in which this dataset can vary, but actually it can be equally described by a proportion along a curved path. So SVD in this scenario will tend to report more dimensions than is strictly necessary to describe the dataset.